It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovant, along with my co-host David Feldman. How are you today, David?
Well, you live long enough, you see everything. I just witnessed Ralph Nader getting a robocall and being resigned about it.
Oh, he'll get them back. Don't worry. We actually did a show on robocalls, if you recall, a few months ago.
He just got one 30 seconds ago before we started.
Yeah. And of course, the man we're speaking about, the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
Good show today. The show is actually sort of thematic today. The state of capitalism is our theme on today's program. Both of our guests today provide a unique take on the issue. And I've heard Ralph say that when capitalism crashes, socialism is always there to save it. Well, our first guest argues for ways that capitalism can save itself. Washington Post business columnist Stephen Pearlstein has a new book out entitled, very bluntly, Can American Capitalism Survive? In that book, he critiques unfettered free market capitalism and how it has undermined not only our democracy, but the very concept of capitalism itself. In the 80s, we were told that greed is good. Not many people grasped that when filmmaker Oliver Stone wrote those words, which were uttered by the character Gordon Gekko in the movie Wall Street, that he was actually trying to satirize the idea. A lot of people took it seriously. And those words reflected the attitude of the Reagan Revolution and the corporate pushback against Roosevelt's New Deal. Well, we'll find out if capitalism and democracy are compatible as Mr. Pearlstein lays out ways we can revive the true spirit of Adam Smith, probably the original and most misunderstood capitalist. Then in the second half of the show, we're going to take a deep dive into a very specific fault in the capitalist system, also one of Ralph's pet peeves, stock buybacks. Regular listeners to the show have heard Ralph rail against corporate management using excess profits to buy back their own stock in order to inflate the company's share price and therefore qualify for bonuses. Well, stock buybacks have no productive value. They don't create jobs. They stifle innovation. They exacerbate income inequality. And go to Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel to hear Ralph rake Apple over the coals for celebrating its recent $1 trillion valuation, fueled in part by buying back its own stock. So joining us today in the second half of the show is an absolute expert on that topic, economist William Lazonick. He calls the practice legalized looting. And as we all know, it's not a show unless we check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's ask the big question, can American capitalism survive? David?
Stephen Pearlstein is an award-winning business and economics columnist for the Washington Post. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for commentary for columns explaining the global financial crisis. His latest work is Can American Capitalism Survive? Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Stephen Pearlstein.
I'm honored to be here.
Welcome indeed, Steve. Let's get to your wonderful book here. This is a book for you to read, listeners, because it covers a huge range of forces beyond your control and forces that can be within your control and your daily livelihood and quality of life. It's only about 200 pages, but I'm amazed how much you got into it. And just to give people an idea of what's in the book, is just 5 chapters. One is greed good? 2, not so just desserts? 3, is equality of opportunity possible or even desirable? And 4, fairness and growth, a false choice? And 5, your recommendations, titled Better Capitalism. And I do have to alert people, this is not about your local mom and pop store. This is not about small town retail business. It's not irrelevant to what Steve is writing about. This is about larger corporations. And I've always wondered, Steve, that these large corporations that call themselves capitalists, they actually violate some of the basic principles of capitalism. First of all, they strip their owner shareholders of almost any power over the hired hands at the top of the company. You're not supposed to do that in capitalism. If you own something, you should have some reasonable control. The second is that when they get in trouble, unlike small business going bankrupt, obeying the verdict of the market, they go to Washington for bewildering amount of corporate welfare services or crony capitalism. Third, when they want to compete against smaller companies, oftentimes they don't compete fairly. They use predatory practices. They get government to help them against these smaller firms. So I think that's why I always like to call it corporate capitalism rather than just capitalism, because they really violate the basic principles of capitalism. So let me ask you the first one. Is greed good? How do you handle that in the book?
Well, I go back to two of the people who are intellectually associated with that idea, Adam Smith and Charles Darwin. And I look at, in the case of Adam Smith, everyone who takes Economics 101 knows the famous line about, and I'm not quoting exactly, but it's not out of regard for their customers that the butcher and the baker provide you with your dinner, but out of self-regard, that is, out of their own self-interest. And yes, it's true. Capitalism is a system that works because everyone pursues his or her own self-interest, and in the process, as if magically, through the intervention of an invisible hand, not only do we maximize our own individual welfare, but this system maximizes the welfare, the economic welfare of everybody. And it's true. Capitalism has been the thing since the Industrial Revolution that has, brought billions of people out of poverty, and it continues to do so. And it is a system based on this sort of self-regard, this selfishness, this self-interestedness. But even Adam Smith understood that there are limits to that. And if you actually read what he wrote, rather than just, remember that one famous phrase, you'll find out that he actually was a rather keen observer about the economic system and about human motivation, and that we have multiple motivations, and that the system doesn't work, in fact, if everyone pushes that selfishness and greed too far, because it erodes social capital. That is, it erodes the trust that we have in each other. That is very necessary, particularly a complex economy, to work. We just don't have enough judges and prosecutors and bailiffs and lawyers if we can't trust each other in our everyday interactions with each other. And if people don't trust the people they're dealing with, then capitalism won't work. And so we need not only laws, we need norms of behavior that people don't push it to the extreme. Charles Darwin, by the way, is also used as, survival of the fittest, which actually is not a term he ever used, but that's the only way that the species can improve, and we need to allow the survival of the fittest in business, even if it is a bit mean and ruthless. Well, if you read Charles Darwin, what Charles Darwin says is there is a reason why our species is at the top of the food chain, and it is because human beings know how to cooperate with each other. They know how to trust, they learn how to trust each other. And it is this cooperation and this feeling of selflessness that allows some tribes to actually prevail over other tribes. And that is now hardwired into our nature. So while we do all have a selfish gene, we also all have a cooperative gene. Sometimes they're in conflict with each other, and we need to resolve that. But it is not true that by our nature we are only selfish. We are also generous and cooperative and empathetic.
In your second chapter, Not So Just Desserts, which really goes to the core of reader interest, I think, in this book, you mentioned free market capitalism in the U.S. Most of the benefits of economic growth have been captured by the richest 10%. It has also been used to provide justification for squeezing workers, cheating consumers, avoiding taxes, and leaving communities in the lurch. As a result, Americans are losing faith that a free market economy is the best system. I'm quoting. Indeed, I've startled recently, and I'm sure Steve and David were, by the polls showing that more and more people, especially young people, favor what they think is socialism, like Bernie Sanders type socialism, Medicare for all, and a living wage by law. What points do you make in Not So Just Desserts, second chapter in your book,
Right.
Can American Capitalism Survive?
So essential to the sort of intellectual argument for this sort of market fundamentalism that we've embraced in the United States over the last 40 years is the idea that what anyone earns in the marketplace, their market income, their salary, their wages, what they earn from their investments, is an accurate and objective reflection of their personal economic contribution. In other words, they earned it. It is their just desert. And if you tamper with that, you tamper too much with the incentives of capitalism, and it amounts, if you take it from some people who are more productive and give it to people who are less productive, it's the equivalent of theft in a moral sense. And that is the sort of classic liberal argument and the classic fundamentalist argument, capitalist fundamentalist argument. What I try to point out, I think fairly successfully, is that what any of us earns in the marketplace is to some extent a reflection of your economic contribution, but to a considerable extent also a reflection of the laws and the norms that we have that decide how the pie is divided, and that these laws and norms are not objective, they're very subjective and political. So that if we decide that slavery is no longer legal, well, that changes the distribution of income. If we decide that there should be a minimum income, well, that changes the distribution of income. If we decide that Steve Schwarzman at the Blackstone Group of hedge fund shouldn't pay income taxes on what he earns, but should only pay capital gains taxes, which is half of that, well, then we change the market income. And we do this in all sorts of ways. Some of it is laws, some of it is norms. In the old days, Ralph, you remember, in most big companies that did well shared their profits with all their employees. And so the secretaries and the janitors at the old IBM earned more than secretaries and janitors elsewhere. Why? It was because it was a norm in corporations that you shared the success, and you didn't want the income to be too unequal. Well, today we have a different norm than that. What we do today is we outsource the secretaries and the janitors so we don't have to abide by those norms. Okay? That changed the distribution of income. So when people say, I earned that, when someone can point to a salary or when a hedge fund guy can point to $1 billion salary or take-home pay and say, I earned that, well, yeah, he earned it under a certain set of laws and norms, and if we wanted to change those laws and norms, maybe he could only earn $500 million. And so it isn't objective, and there is no perfectly objective system. That's the fallacy of capitalism, that there could be a perfectly objective one if government would just get out of the way. There is no perfectly objective measure of economic contribution except in one system, which is called the jungle. In the jungle where the strongest guy gets everything, that is a perfect reflection, I suppose, of economic contribution and relative value. But if you're going to have any rules, you automatically start to tinker with the distribution of income. And so the question is really whether I deserve this, but whether we like the distribution of income. And if we don't like it, which a lot of people don't today, then we might want to change the rules and the norms.
And Steve, I'm going to ask you what you mean by pre-distribution.
Okay.
When John Kerry ran for president in 2004, he addressed a business audience in New Jersey, and he said right at the beginning, I am not a redistributionist. And there was a roar of approval from the business audience because they knew what he meant, of course.
Right.
But let me set the stage for your description of what you mean by pre-distribution as more economic justice. On page 61 of your book, you basically talk about the profits of Apple that came from American engineers developing the technology. You say the lion's share of the profit from the sale of every iPhone, iPad, and MacBook computer had wound up in the hands of a wholly owned Irish subsidiary of Apple that had few employees and for tax purposes was a resident of no country. And this clever gambit saved Apple $9 billion in taxes in 2012 alone. It's a quoting from your book. Now, I think that fits right in with your point about pre-distribution. You want to explain?
Well, it does, because the tax laws of not just our country, but now of a lot of different countries, combined meant that basically Apple's shareholders got a much bigger profit than they would have if those laws had been different. And I think you and I would agree had been somewhat fairer, and Apple had paid more money in taxes. Well, what would have happened? Well, that money in taxes might have been used to provide services that otherwise would not be there for people who are poorer or sicker It could also have been used for infrastructure. There's lots of ways tax money could be used, but that affected the distribution of income because it meant that the people who were the beneficiaries of what might have been additional government spending didn't get that, whereas the shareholders of Apple got it instead. And pre-distribution is simply a fancy economist way of saying, look, if we want an economic system that divides the pie more fairly, we can do it two ways. We can let the market do what it wants under existing rules and then redistribute afterwards, that is, tax rich people more and give it to poor people in some fashion. Or, in my opinion, the better strategy is do a minimal amount of redistribution, but do the pre-distribution, that is to change the laws and the norms that determine market incomes before taxes. That's a better way to do it. That's a stabler and, frankly, more politically acceptable way to do it than to have tax rates of 60 and 70% that some people like and then redistribute that money to other people. To me, that doesn't feel right. And it's not just to me, to a lot of Americans, that doesn't feel right. But if that redistribution is, in a sense, done beforehand, pre-distribution, then it's a little more hidden, and we find it more acceptable, more morally acceptable, more politically acceptable, and I would argue it's actually more economically preferable as well.
Well, that gets us into your surprising view to a lot of people that equality of opportunity really is not possible or even desirable.
Well, this is a controversial idea because it has some echoes of things that we don't like. But the fact of the matter is that we now have a lot of very sophisticated social science that shows us, and physical science, that is biology and psychology, that shows us that half the difference in income between any two people that you would pick at random on the street, half the difference in their income is attributable to who their parents were. And that is both a physical thing, that is a genetic thing, which traits and capabilities and talents they inherited, but also it is a reflection of nurture, nature and nurture. That is to say, what talents were able to be nurtured and developed in the early years of life because their parents were either wealthier or not wealthier, because their parents held them or didn't, their parents read to them or did not. And that half the difference in income is attributable to that. Well, there's nothing we can do about that after the fact, after the first few years of life and after you get your genetic makeup. And as a result of that, the talents that we have are very different, and that results in very different income differences. And so it will never be true that we all start out at the same starting line in life. If you start out 7'5", you're going to probably be more likely to pay for the NBA than I am, okay? And you're going to be able to make a lot more money. Who can we credit that with? Is that the 7'5" person or my fault, or is it because of something he did? No, he inherited that. And so there's a limit to how equal opportunity can be. And the only way we could perhaps make opportunity a little more equal is if we took all children away from their parents at birth and send them to state-run schools for the first 15 years of life and gave them all the exact same education. Well, I suppose we could make opportunity more equal, but that's why we don't do that, because we don't want to do that, and we probably shouldn't do that. And as a result of that, we have to accept the fact that opportunity can never be equal. It's more equal than it used to be 200 years ago. It's certainly true that women have more opportunity and people who aren't white have more opportunity and people who are poor have more opportunity than they did 200 years ago, but we'll never make it equal. And if there are people who say, look, and these are the market fundamentalists, we shouldn't care about inequality of income. All that matters is inequality of opportunity. Well, the truth is we never can have equality of opportunity. And so, again, if you're unhappy with the distribution of income, you can't rely solely on making opportunity more equal. You might have to do things like redistribution or pre-distribution.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, there's so many examples of this. When we did the study on standardized testing, SAT, the scores of the students correlated with family income. And people said, what? What do you mean? And I said, yeah, if you grow up in Scarsdale or Belmont, Massachusetts, you don't have sirens at night, you don't have rats flowing around, you don't have undernutrition and all kinds of tenant problems from landlords. You're likely to grow up learning how to score higher on these tests. And of course, if you do, then all kinds of opportunity opens to you compared to people, youngsters who start out in dire poverty. But let's get to your recommendations, because it leads right into one of them, which is universal basic income. Can you give us rather briefly, because of time problems, right, Steve, the kind of major recommendations that come out of your many, many years of analysis here?
Well, you mentioned universal basic income. Mine is not a very radical one, and I don't call it that. I call it a citizen's dividend. And basically, I'm talking about $3,000 per year per person as a dividend to all Americans, a dividend like a company for the bounty that our country and our system, not only our natural resources, but our very good, or once was very good political system and our economic system, we all ought to enjoy that together, and we all ought to get the same. And now that sounds like, well, gee, that might be expensive. For example, if you have a family of four, that's $12,000. And when you combine that with even today's low minimum wage, that would put almost everybody who is in a working household above the poverty level, which would be a pretty good accomplishment. It's not as much of a UBI as other people want, but it's, I think, a place to start. But here's the thing about UBI. I mean, the money doesn't grow on trees. You have to raise it from somebody. And essentially what I propose is that basically you send a check to everybody on July 4th of every year, okay? But then in the tax code, you basically take away with one hand what you give with the other hand for people who have household incomes, above 120% of the median or something like that. So that how do you pay for that is you tax people who are more successful in the marketplace and provide that safety net for everybody. But I like to put it in terms of a dividend rather than in terms of welfare. And the way I also emphasize that is that in addition to that, I would pair that with 3 years of required universal service sometime during your lifetime. Not necessarily when you're young, could be any time during your lifetime, including retirement. And that so while we both have a right to not live in poverty, we also have an obligation to contribute. And I like to frame it that way because I think it's politically more acceptable, and it really enhances the idea that we are responsible for each other. And it helps to encourage social capital, which I mentioned at the beginning. That is the trust and the feeling of obligation that we have for each other.
You have wonderful examples of national service also. On page 179, you talk about some will want to staff pre-K centers for poor children, or others might want to prefer after-school and summer recreation programs or mentoring high school dropouts. Some might think the highest priority is building low-income housing, blazing hiking trails in national forests, and competing for volunteers. The most effective and impactful nonprofits are likely to grow, while the least effective wither away. You also, of course, call for limiting special interest money in politics. That's another one. You call for sharing profits, profit sharing with employees. The evidence is overwhelming. The companies that have profit sharing just do better all around.
Again, I wouldn't pass a law saying all companies must, but I would change the tax code so that there is a big tax penalty for a company that doesn't have some sort of profit sharing plan. And by the way, I wouldn't prescribe one plan. There's all sorts of ways to share profits with companies. And let me remind people that when there are no profits, there are no profits to share as well. So employees would do less well when the company does less well, and do well when the company does well. It seems to me that's pretty basic, human resource management. Most of the studies, as you say, show that that's useful. And, we have it in about a third of companies today. Big companies a little more than smaller companies in this respect, actually, Ralph. Small companies lag behind in profit sharing.
Well, they lag behind in profit markups, too,
yes,
for the most part. Speaking of that, you also favor strong antitrust enforcement. You call it reducing concentration and restoring competition, and you don't let companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon off the hook on this as well.
And the biggest source of inequality in recent years, Ralph, is not between people who have a college education and don't. That was always a big gap, but it's not getting any bigger particularly. The biggest gap in income inequality, the biggest driver of income inequality is between an engineer at Google and an engineer at some small company in the middle of North Dakota. It's between a human resource official at Facebook and a human resource executive at some, company that doesn't earn so much money. So concentration is concentrating not only profits in a certain company, it's actually concentrating earned income in certain successful companies. And what is the main characteristic of these companies? They have market power. That is, there's over-concentration. They are able to dictate the price rather than simply to take the price from the marketplace. And so antitrust is now got to be a central feature of any program to make the distribution of income more equitable.
Correct. They also have patent monopoly advantages. They have corporate welfare. Government R&D built a lot of these major industries, from nanotech to biotech to pharmaceutical, not to mention Silicon Valley, whose executives admitted it in congressional hearings. Say we need more government research for basic research. We don't do basic research. We do applied research,
right,
like Apple building its iPhone. The one thing I never dreamed corporate capitalism would ever exhibit when I was at law school is that they don't know what to do with their money. They have generated so much profit from consumer sales and other government benefits that they have spent in the U.S. alone $7 trillion on stock buybacks, buying back their stock, increasing the metrics for their own executive compensation. And as Steve Skorban said at the beginning, that, these stock buybacks don't create jobs. They don't engage in productive enterprise. They don't shore up pension plans that are underfunded for their workers. They don't do research and development and create new services, etc. How do you deal with these corporate executives who don't know what to do with their cash other than stock buybacks?
Well, Ralph, I don't like most stock buybacks. I agree. But you and I might disagree on this in a little bit. Let's put aside the question of how much profits companies earn. If they earn it and they don't have if they don't find that they have a place where they can invest it and get a good return, then they really should return it to their shareholders. But the first thing I would say is they should return it to their shareholders in the old-fashioned way, which is pay them a dividend.
Right.
Okay,
how about reducing the consumer price of the iPhone?
Well, they might, but apparently they don't have to. You see, if reducing the price would increase their sales and profits, they would have done that. And that's probably true. But they don't need to in the case of, you just mentioned one, because they don't have to. They have a sort of quasi-monopoly, or their product is so good, they don't have to do that. Well, fine. But return the profit to the shareholder as a dividend. Why is that important? The reason they use stock buybacks is to avoid taxes, Ralph. That's the only reason they do that. So the first thing would happen, if you pay a dividend, the government will get some taxes on it, and they'll get taxes earned at the ordinary tax rate, not the capital gains rate. And
people will spend it. Shareholders get more dividends. They'll buy more in the market. The mutual funds and the pension funds will get more money, and they represent millions and millions of investors.
Right.
Yeah, I'm all for it.
Or they will reinvest it in a company that does have a better use for it. The argument, and it was not a bad argument, that one of the reasons we don't want companies to retain too much of their profits is they have a tendency, to use it to buy other companies, which isn't productive, as you know, or they have a tendency to invest it in basically in making an empire, in making the company bigger, and doing things that aren't all that profitable, when the better use would be to let the market decide what is the next best investment, rather than let the executives of those companies build empires. So there's a good reason why companies, if they can't figure out something better to do, to give it back to the shareholders. Now you say, well, why don't they give it to their employees? Well, I would say yes, all companies should share profits with employees, but at a particular point, there still may be too much money left over. And, you have to deal with the question of why employees don't get paid more through the labor laws, rather than try to do it, to say, well, they should pay their employees more. Well, there's a reason why they don't. They obviously don't feel they need to in order to attract and retain the best employees. Now, maybe we need to change labor laws so they feel they need to do that, because there's a power imbalance. But as a general rule, I would say you don't want to get into telling corporations what they should do with their profits. The government shouldn't, because I don't think that'll work out so well.
Well, that's where you get into your pre-distribution concept.
Yes.
Walmart is a good example of what you're talking about. It has $50 billion in stock buybacks in the last 10 years. And until recently, had 1 million workers making less today than Walmart workers made in 1968, adjusted for inflation. So, the argument is, hey, if you don't want heavy employee turnover, if you want more motivated workers like Costco pursues, they pay better. Walmart, use some of that money to pay your workers so they can put bread on the table instead of buying back your stock in order to increase the stock value for the Walton family. So,
well, that's correct. And it's not just that. It's not just to be able to have lower turnover and attract more workers. It turns out that in today's world, in a rich country like the United States, some consumers don't like dealing with companies who they know squeeze their workers too much. There are people in the world who won't deal with Walmart because of that. And you know what? There were people in the world who started to boycott Amazon because it wasn't paying its low-level workers enough. And you know what? Amazon responded to that by saying, we're going to pay a $15 minimum wage. And why did they do that? Well, maybe it's because they're nice guys, but I think the real reason they did that was that there were some customers who didn't like dealing with them because they were squeezing their low-end workers, but they were finding it was hard to attract high-end talent because a lot of young people today, talented young people, won't go to work for a company that they think treats its employees badly. So they essentially saw the marketplace sending them signals, which is it's better for us overall if we offer this $15 minimum wage. And Amazon did that. And by the way, after Amazon did that, they said, and by the way, we think the government should pass a law that requires everyone to do that.
Yeah, it's amazing how it's working now. Social media has some benefits. Consumer feedback, very specific to companies, very specific to products, very specific to environmental malfeasance, is really beginning to have an impact. By the way, I just heard a report that the first year under Trump's tax law, corporations who were reporting enormous profits had a reduction in their federal income tax of 26%. And then we wonder why our public works and infrastructure are crumbling, and Trump says we don't have money to pay to rebuild America.
This is one thing, Ralph, that I wish every Democratic presidential candidate would say, which is, there's a group of rich countries called the OECD, and among the OECD, there's an average percentage of GDP that corporations and businesses pay in taxes. By the way, you just can't say corporate. You have to say corporations and non-corporate businesses. There's an average of what percentage of the tax of the GDP that businesses pay. And we should say that's going to be our target too, because we're well below that target. And it's somewhere, percentage of GDP, we should set that. And as a percentage of all tax revenue raised. And right now, corporations are not paying their fair share. If you ask them honestly, they'll say we're not paying our fair share. And we should set that as a target. We shouldn't tax our businesses more than other countries, but we shouldn't tax them less either.
Steve and David, any comments and questions?
Yes, I have a question about jurisdiction. Other than taxation, what can the federal government do to dictate corporate governance? And how does a charter work? Is Walmart chartered in a specific state? So is it up to the state? I don't know, maybe it's chartered in Arkansas. Does Arkansas dictate corporate governments? How does the president or Congress dictate whether or not Walmart has to put union workers on their board?
Well, there are ways the federal government could do that. For example, in the case of publicly traded companies, the Congress could pass laws related to that. I mean, Congress could do all sorts of things that changes the distribution of income within companies. Tax law is one way, labor law is another way. You ask about jurisdiction. Most big corporations are based in Delaware, and Delaware law holds. And Delaware law has been the law that has been used to justify the idea that maximizing shareholder value is the only purpose of a corporation. In fact, that's a fallacy. Delaware law does not require that, but you would be surprised the percentage of directors and executives and even corporate lawyers who believe that to be the case. And so Elizabeth Warren, with whom I disagree about a lot, actually has a suggestion that she got, if she knows it or not, from Ralph Nader, which was that the federal government should charter corporations. And there should be federal laws that dictate the purpose of corporations, that then perhaps say something to the effect that corporations can be run for any purpose, but that there's no one particular set of stakeholders that should benefit over the others. And that would give companies the freedom, if they had a federal charter rather than a Delaware charter, to balance the interests of workers and consumers and communities and the public and their shareholders, rather than feeling as if they had an obligation to put shareholders first.
By the way, this federal chartering of large corporations was proposed in the presidential election of 1912 by conservative William Howard Taft and progressive Teddy Roosevelt.
So it wasn't your idea, Ralph. It was William Howard Taft. Okay.
I just picked it up after a period of ignoring that way of rewriting the contract between the state, meaning the government, and the global corporation. Well, there's a lot we didn't discuss with Steve Pearlstein, and that's why you should read the book and make it a subject of living room conversations. Every change in our country's history started with a conversation between a few people. And we're talking about Steve's recent book, published by St. Martin's Press, called Can American Capitalism Survive? And the subtitles are Why Greed is Not Good, Opportunity is Not Equal, and Fairness Won't Make Us Poor. Pretty provocative. Thank you very much, Steve Pearlstein. Thank you for all your work and your forthcoming writings as well.
Thanks, Steve, David, and of course, Ralph. Good to be with you.
We've been speaking with Stephen Pearlstein, author of Can American Capitalism Survive? We will link to that at ralphnaderradiohour.com. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to discuss in depth one of Ralph's corporate pet peeves, stock buybacks, and actually how it affected the Boeing MAX 8 tragedies. We're going to be doing that with economist William Lazonick. But first, we're going to head over to the National Press Building and hear from our tireless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. Back after this.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, June 21, 2019. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Opioid manufacturer Insys Therapeutics will enter into a deferred prosecution agreement with the federal government. An Insys operating subsidiary will plead guilty to 5 counts of mail fraud, and the company will pay a $2 million fine and $28 million in forfeiture. Insys will also pay $195 million to settle allegations that it violated the False Claims Act. The investigation stemmed from Insys's payment of kickbacks and other unlawful marketing practices in connection with the marketing of Subsys, a fentanyl spray, which is a powerful but highly addictive opioid painkiller. In 2012, Insys began using speaker programs that were actually used as a vehicle to pay bribes and kickbacks to targeted practitioners. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. When the Republican-led Congress and the Trump administration cut the corporate tax rate, they argued that it would spur productivity. Instead, many of these corporations used the excess profits to buy back their own stock. What's wrong with that? Here to tell us is our next guest. David?
William Lazonick is a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. His article, Profits Without Prosperity, Stock Buybacks Manipulate the Market and Leave Most Americans Worse Off, earned the HBR McKinsey Award for Outstanding Article in Harvard Business Review. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, William Lazonick.
Hello, it's good to be here.
I'm going to read a paragraph from your explosive article that came out in the Prospect, a magazine, very recently, connecting Boeing stock buybacks and other investment policies with the decisions that led to the Boeing MAX crashes. Here's the quote. Our research, based on publicly available information, strongly suggests that the dedication of Boeing's senior executives to increasing their company profits and stock yield, which also augmented their own compensation, resulted in management decisions that contributed to the 2 737 MAX crashes. While much more information remains to be discovered, the reported evidence, still unfolding almost daily, points to executive culpability in the crashes that took the lives of 346 passengers and crew, end quote. And you also say, since 2013, Boeing's top management embarked on massive distributions to shareholders through dividends and in far larger sums, stock buybacks, end quote. The connection may seem tenuous to people who don't know anywhere near as much as Bill Lazonick knows. Bill, tell us what the connection is. It's really quite clear once you get the evidence.
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, anybody who's the head of a corporation, say the CEO, CFO, top management, they're going to be worried about decisions they have made that don't work out and ruin their reputations, ruin their careers, lead to them being fired, whatever. And that can happen even if they're not incentivized by stock-based pay. But what you have in the United States is a system under the notion that companies should be run to maximize shareholder value, which is very problematic, that says we incentivize top executives with stock-based pay, or pay that's large components are related to the stock price. So what we show in this article, in addition to the facts of the case as we know them in the Boeing crashes and in the development of the plane, or the lack of development of the plane, the concealing of information, etc., that may have contributed to the crashes, is we document the extent to which, as we now know it, an unsafe plane was being sold in the thousands. They sold over 5,000 of these 737 MAXs by March of 2019. As these planes were being sold, the executives had every reason to know that they were unsafe. And meanwhile, they were benefiting from having the best-selling plane in the history of a company that's over 100 years old. To the top executive, Nuremberg, it was to the tune of about $2 million per month that he was pulling into his bank account from his various types of executive pay. Most of it, as we documented in the article, people can look at the numbers, most of it stock-based or related to metrics related to the stock market. So now if that metric actually represented the actual performance of the company, we might still think that that's way too much. And I'd say that it is, because you have a company of tens of thousands of people in which the products it produces depend on their skill and effort. We have, as I just heard at the end of the previous segment, you were talking about the extent to which the government subsidizes corporations. That couldn't be more true than a company like Boeing in its history and including now. So for these top executives to be reaping all these gains from the stock market is problematic. For Muhlenberg, since 2015, became CEO through 2018, it was about $96 million. But in addition, they're doing it because they're basically hyping the stock market. And even more than that, and this is where buybacks come in, they're manipulating the stock market. So the types of stock buybacks they're doing, which are open market repurchases, where the broker for the company is going in, increasing the demand for stock, which were about $43 billion from 2013 to the first quarter of 2019. That's as well over 100% of their profits, in addition to very ample dividends. Dividends were about 40% of their profits, and Boeing was known as a dividend rock star. So their shareholders getting dividends. They're doing all these buybacks, and the sole purpose of doing these buybacks is to give an artificial manipulative boost to the company's stock price. They gain directly from that activity.
And that affects their management decisions about whether to build a new plane in 2011 or whether to go with the defective 737 Boeing MAX.
Yeah, well, we need to do a lot more, and there should be congressional inquiries into their failure to develop a wholly redesigned, a clean sheet replacement to the 737NG, which they should have done, and actually they did start a project to do that. There needs to be investigations into, once they decided to do that, how they concealed the extent to which it was unsafe and the extent to which they had and even the existence of a software fix to make it seem like it wasn't unsafe, now known as the MCAS. So that certainly could have been affected by the way they were being paid. What we do know is that back in around 2005 to 2010, when they had the opportunity and in many ways the need to do a clean sheet replacement because of advances in avionics, advances in materials, and that's what they should have done. The estimate of the extra cost of doing that over a re-engined upgrade to the 737 MAX was $7 billion. Now, even between 2004 and 2008, besides paying ample dividends, they did $11 billion in buybacks. Now, we can't say necessarily that they still didn't have the money to do the wholly redesigned plane, but they made decisions about allocating resources that, in effect, it was more important to manipulate their stock price than to have a plane for the future, the plane that they should have built at that time. And then once they have all these sales of the planes, they were doing on average about $7 billion a year between 2013 and 2000. And really, they were doing them right up until the second crash in March. In fact, one of the things we show is that on December 17th, 2018, less than 2 months after the Lion Air crash, with their stock price still soaring, in fact, they had become about 10% of the weight of the Dow Jones, which only has 30 stocks. So it was really, everybody was watching Boeing stock because they had all these sales and because they were boosting their stock price. The board took a decision to increase the dividend. This is less than 2 months after the first crash, to increase the dividend by 20%, because that's how great they were performing, and to authorize a new $20 billion stock buyback program. So they had done about average $9.1 billion the previous 2 years, 2017, 2018. I think they would have done at least $12 billion in 2019 if it hadn't been for the crash. So they did about $2.3 billion, all it appears, before the crash on March 10th. And on March 1st, 2019, their stock price hit an all-time peak. So people were discounting basically the first crash as just an anomaly, as an unworthy plane, as pilot error or something like that, until, of course, the second crash occurred. And it was quite clear, because now you had done investigations of the first crash and its causes. People saw it was for the exact same reason. And that, of course, led to the grounding of the planes. But yes, they would have just pursued this strategy of getting the stock price up as much as possible. That's the top priority for the company, and they're lining their pockets as a result of doing that.
And here's the sequence, listeners. Boeing was known as a superb engineering company until its managers and executives decided to turn it into basically an investment priority company with higher stock values and higher compensation for the executives. So here's the consequence for airline travelers, that when a company makes big profits and doesn't reinvest them in updated and superior aircraft and goes with an old fuselage with overloaded engines, a fuselage based on 1960 technology, it's not good for air travel and air travel safety, as the next of kin have realized in the Indonesian-Ethiopian crashes so tragically. And here is the most important thing listeners can remember from Bill's study. I'm going to quote, between the first quarter of 2013 and the first quarter of 2019, Boeing spent $43 billion on buybacks, and that was equal, listen to this, to 104% of profits. If you put the dividends of Boeing to shareholders and the stock buybacks mean bigger in dollars, Bill, together, it exceeds the corporate profits. So, of course, they're not going to reinvest in a clean sheet new aircraft, and they're going to go with the hoped-up Boeing 737 MAX. Am I reading your article correctly?
Yeah. So they're making allocative decisions, which are putting in, as you stated it, I mean, you can sum it up, they're boosting the stock price way ahead of passenger safety. And there is no doubt that if you run an aircraft manufacturing company that the fundamental purpose of that company is to produce a safe plane. It's not to make profits. If you produce a safe plane, you should be able to make profits. And in Boeing's case, it was easy to make profits because there's only two in the industry. And as you said, Boeing has a long history of engineering capability. It could do whatever engineering it wanted, given available technology and even advancing technology, given the people that Boeing can hire, the types of planes it could build. So it's not a question even of is there any uncertainty that if it builds the safest plane possible, the most advanced plane possible, the most fuel efficient plane possible, is it going to make profits? Of course it's going to make profits. But those profits then should be reinvested in a company, and actually a big chunk of it, it's not just Boeing, it's all companies, should be paying us as taxpayers back for all the money that we spent on infrastructure and knowledge and subsidies that support these companies once they start making all these profits. And of course, under the notion that companies should be run to maximize shareholder value, and again, it's not Boeing, this is an American disease, then that's not what companies are doing. So what's going on in Boeing is going on virtually every large company in the United States. There's this pot of gold that is there because of the success of the company, which has actually zero to do with the public shareholders.
And that's why, as your research demonstrates, about $7 trillion in the last 10 years have been blown away with stock buybacks.
Yeah,
that money coming from consumers and government programs, which doesn't create any new jobs, as you pointed out in your many articles. Do you think you're going to be able to testify before the House or the Senate on the continuing Boeing 737 MAX crash investigations, Bill? Well,
sure. If I'm asked to, I will. Yeah, certainly. Insofar as, my knowledge of the industry, I might say that my co-author, Stankins, who's a professor of economics in Paris, he did his PhD thesis at the University of Bordeaux 3 years ago on comparing Airbus and Boeing and their business models and all the various types of strategies on really this question of the tension between innovation and financialization. And one of the things, of course, as I said, we know that this is and a lot of the articles I've written have shown that this is a problem for the U.S. corporate economy as a whole, for us as a whole, as U.S. citizens. But it also is very important to know the details of each case, to see what choices were made and what choices weren't made, to see the damage that this obsession with shareholder value has done, particularly when you can root the company not just by paying dividends, which are the traditional way of getting a yield to shareholders, but in addition, on top of that, massive amounts of stock buybacks.
And I might add, it led Dennis Muhlenberg to have a board of directors that's a rubber stamp. There's nobody on the Boeing board of directors who has any experience with commercial aviation. Carolyn Kennedy is on the board, former ambassador to Japan. She might be better placed on the board of the ACLU and the kind of work she did before she was on the board of Boeing.
Absolutely.
Nikki Haley, who was governor of South Carolina and facilitated Boeing's opening of a heavily subsidized non-union manufacturing plant in South Carolina, has just been appointed to the board. And the question we're asking is, what did Dennis Muhlenberg tell the board and when about the Boeing 737 MAX? And if they kept the board in the dark, there's a problem with the SEC on that. Yes. And if they told the board of directors all the misleading stuff that they told the public and the FAA and the airlines and the pilot unions, then the board is in serious complicity. So you see, one thing leads to another when you move from an engineering company to an investment stock value company.
Yeah, certainly. And the fact is, we know quite a bit of, and as you quoted, when we published this article May 31st, and I think it's still the case now, that new facts are coming out almost daily about this situation. The planes are still grounded. We don't know what's going to happen to the company. But the fact is that we need to find out a lot more. And a lot more is only going to be discovered if you have a serious congressional inquiry into this, which delves into, which really asks the hard questions of who knew what when. And, I think that all the evidence points to that will not look good for Boeing stock executives.
And I might quote your conclusion from a long analytic article in the Prospect, which was called Make Passengers Safer? Boeing Just Made Shareholders Richer. And your conclusion is, for this failure, Boeing's senior executives should be fired and the many millions they awarded themselves clawed back. The Boeing board should be replaced by directors who are able and willing to serve the public interest for safe, fuel-efficient, and cost-effective aircraft, end quote. For the record, Boeing directors are paid over $300,000 each for attending a few meetings and leafing through some briefing books. Over $300,000 each per year. Thank you very much, Bill Lazonick, who's done the greatest work in the country on this grotesque mutation of corporate capitalism, where they're piling up profits, don't know what to do with it other than to enrich their own compensation through stock buybacks that don't create any jobs, don't do any research and development, don't lower the prices of their products, don't shore up their underfunded pension funds, etc., etc. The latest grotesque mutation of giant global capitalism, not knowing what to do with the massive profits they say piled up, other than to distort investment priorities and enrich themselves at the top of the corporation. Thank you very much, Bill.
Yeah, well, thank you for the work that you continue to do as well. Thanks.
You're welcome.
We've been speaking with economist William Lazonick. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. I want to thank our guests again, Stephen Pearlstein and William Lazonick. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And Ralph has got 2 new books out. The Fable, How the Rats Reformed the Congress. To acquire a copy of that, go to ratsreformcongress.org. And To the Ramparts, How Bush and Obama Paved the Way for the Trump presidency and Why It Isn't Too Late to Reverse Course. We will link to that also.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome back Ellen Brown with her new book, Banking on the People, Democratizing Money in the Digital Age. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. And if you're a high school teacher out there and you want your students to get interested in Congress, let me recommend How the Rats Reformed the Congress.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, and welcome to the Wrap-Up. First, Steve asks a question of Stephen Pearlstein.
Steve Scorban, anything there?
Yes, I have a question. You mentioned Elizabeth Warren. We've mentioned, is there anybody out there, whether they're running for president or not, on the political scene who is speaking your language, Mr. Pearlstein, who's talking about solving these problems of capitalism the way you're talking about them?
Well, Joe Kennedy's talking about it. I think Amy Klobuchar is talking about it. Elizabeth Warren is certainly talking about it. Bernie Sanders talks about it. They each take different approaches to it, and they each focus on different things. But I think there's a lot of, frankly, a fair amount of ferment on the Democratic side on rethinking capitalism. And every day that goes by, I think more people realize that we have to go back to sort of some fundamental ideas about what capitalism is. If we start having too many arguments about this narrow policy or that narrow policy, we can tie ourselves up in political knots. I think we need to go back to some very basic first principles like, what is the purpose of a corporation? How much should businesses contribute to the total tax thing? What is the fundamental relationship between a company and its employees? If we go back to those questions and we try to answer them in simple English, I think most people would agree on things. Then it's a question of how do you structure the policies to achieve those results. But rather than arguing about narrow policies, like should there be 3, labor people on every board of directors, I think we've got to sort of step back and ask the question of, what obligations do employees have to companies and what obligations do companies have to their employees? And once you have that conversation, I think we need to set up systems that allow companies to answer those questions in different ways. Don't be so prescriptive about it, but within a general framework of an understanding, for example, that all companies should share their profits with their employees. I didn't say how much of their profits. I didn't say what mechanism. I think we should be a little flexible about that. But we should all, I think, and we all can agree on something like all companies should share profits with employees. And let's start there rather than getting into very nitty policy debates, which frankly the public doesn't have much of a passion for and probably doesn't have enough information to be able to make a judgment. But they can make judgments about those broad concepts about how a capitalist system should work.
Yeah, and how people can be given the facilities to organize as workers, consumers, taxpayers. Most people think unions are a good thing,
right.
And unions are shrinking in number to the lowest in 50 years.
And now David and Ralph get into a discussion about the nature of corporations.
I had a question for Ralph. So if you're like a billionaire and you start a business and you never become a corporation and you start making more billions, do you have to be chartered by anybody? Can you be like an LLC and not have to answer to anybody?
Yeah, you don't have to be a corporation. You can be as rich as you can running a business, but nobody does that because corporations provide all kinds of immunities, limited liability, deductions that are not accorded a mortal human being as a proprietor of a giant business.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know any billionaire in business who actually is not a corporation. Even Hollywood stars, who make huge money, tend to actually incorporate themselves.
And once you do that, once you become a corporation, you have to be chartered somewhere.
Yes.
You open yourself up to the government. The government can then pry
they can theoretically pull the charter. They can condition the charter, but they don't. Not since the late 19th century when they pulled the charter, for example, Standard Oil of Ohio, because it was misbehaving. The corporations have made sure that the charter is not a mechanism anymore for accountability. But that's a possible reform, and we can say, why not?
Right.
Yeah.
If a Democratic presidential candidate were to say, we have the legal authority because they're chartered, we can dictate such and such, it would end up getting challenged in the courts, though, wouldn't it? They'd go to the Supreme Court to fight.
Whatever privileges of incorporation that a state government gives corporations can be conditioned. I mean, they're conditioned now. For example, they have to put out annual shareholder reports. But what we're talking about is conditioning them on really important things like environment and the way they treat their workers and so forth.
Last question. They would say it was a 14th Amendment issue. Like, why are you targeting this specific corporation on the environment and not all the corporations, right?
Yeah, but when you're dealing with charter, you can focus it just like you can prosecute individual companies or individual people, but not everybody.
See, this is the discussion that nobody's having.
That's right.
Like, this is what they should be talking about.
That's right.
What we can actually do.
That's right.
Corporations
are created by state power and authority. And 99% of the people, when you ask them who creates corporations, they will say investors, financiers. No, they fund corporations. Corporations do not exist without state charters because they give them so many immunities, starting with limited liability for their shareholders. And, most businessmen who want to make, or businesswomen who want to make a lot of money, don't even consider avoiding being incorporated because it has so many privileges, so many advantages, so many protections.
It's the ignorance of people saying, get the government out of my Medicare. People don't understand what a corporation is. A corporation is almost socialism. It's It's not socialism, but it's cooperating with the government. You can't exist without the government.
That's right. Well, it is corporate socialism when they're getting corporate welfare handouts, subsidies, giveaways, bailouts, lowball contracts with the government. It is corporate socialism. And if Bernie Sanders wants to explain democratic socialism, he ought to start by saying, look, Americans, you got two choices. You either accept more corporate socialism, control of the government that's turned against you, and the taxes are escaping these corporations and they're mistreating you. Corporate socialism is what is the state of our economy now. Or you can take democratic socialism, a living wage, full health insurance, decent pensions, the rights for labor to organize easier labor unions, and redirecting tax dollars back home to improve your public services and infrastructure. See, that's the kind of thing he should make. Otherwise, he's going to be constantly on the defensive with that phrase, democratic socialism.
I mean, you've been talking about this for 50 years. You can't have a corporation without government.
That's right.
And people don't know that.
They don't know that. And that's because, look at your own education, David. Elementary school, high school, college. You ever study the corporation? Do you ever study corporate law firms that produce the architecture?
Nope.
See?
Finally, Ralph gets into a lengthy discussion about a study Stephen Pearlstein did on how everyday consumer products are marked up.
Just before we dig into your book, which is really a very concise and readable treatment of existing corporate capitalism, I think you're talking about the bigger companies, not so much the smaller companies. I came across a series of your articles in the Washington Post I've never read anywhere before. And basically, you took certain consumer products, like furniture or cars or other household products, and you analyzed the markups that led to the retail price. So when people want to buy furniture and they open the newspaper and they see a big ad, 50% off, they might wonder, they're still making profit after they have a 50% discount. Can you give us an idea of how hard it is to do this kind of analysis? But you took it all the way from the raw material in the consumer product and then took it to the wholesaler and then the retailer. Can you give us a little flavor of the few examples? Because I think that's the one thing consumers don't know much about. And when they're talking about pharmaceuticals, textiles, that is a real deep insight into market practices and markups.
Well, it was a series called Why It Costs, and actually they weren't articles per se. They were really infographics. It was just a picture of something, like, say, a pair of eyeglasses, and then an accounting of how much, the direct costs of materials and labor were, what other overhead costs were at the manufacturer, and then as it went through the process, perhaps through a wholesaler and then through a retailer. What made it very difficult is that, the answer to these things, or the accounting, always depends on which company at which time selling through which channels. And of course, in any industry, there's almost an infinite variety of answers to those questions. So to be able to say something intelligent and sort of average it all together was very difficult. And you just had to call a gazillion companies. And you can just imagine, Ralph, you call up a company and say, hey, I'm from the Washington Post. I want to know what your cost structure is. And they're not too eager to help you with that. So I never called them first. What I would do is I would call industry consultants and ask who had worked with a number of companies and ask them to try to take either a wholesale price or a retail price, depending on where they were in the chain, and sort of break it down and say, let's just roughly ballpark it. And then I do go to another, and I'd say, well, I talked to guy A, and what do you think about he says? And then, well, I don't know. I think he's a little up on that, a little down on that. And then, then I would maybe call a couple of companies and say, well, I've tried this, called some consultants, and what do you think about that? And sometimes, again, not for attribution basis, they'd give me some answers, and then I call some retailers and try the same thing. And eventually I was able to get, a sort of ballpark thing so that people could have a rough understanding of where their, I don't know whether you've bought glasses lately, but prescription glasses lately, but it can easily go $800, $1,000, $1,200 if you get all the fancy lens characteristics, and try to break that down. And then I would say, this is an example that goes through this channel, and let me specify a little more detail about the product so that I could justify it. As it turns out, I never really got a complaint about the fact that I was wrong or I was way off base. In other words, no one from any company ever called or industry called and say, you got this totally wrong. And that's because I mostly would try to check it with them. I would call just an example, the American Eyeglass Retailers Association or whatever that's called and say, look, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to send you a copy of it. Tell me if you think I'm wrong. And either they didn't respond or they did respond. But if they responded and they had a good point to make, I'd make some changes. If they didn't respond, then of course they couldn't complain about it because I'd given them an opportunity.
Well, one of the reasons I was so fascinated by your findings is because people would come to me and they'd hold up a little hearing aid and they'd say, why is this costing $3,500? That's what I paid for my pretty good used car the other day. And it just doesn't make sense to people. And of course, $10 a pill, for a drug.
Right.
Because a lot of it isn't actually raw materials and markups.
No, or labor, or even a reasonable level of profit that you would expect and hope, someone to earn. If someone has a 10 or 15% profit margin on sales, the average in the United States is somewhere between 5 and 10, but there are some industries that have a little more. But when the profit margin on the sale is 50% or 60%, something else is going on there. Obviously, that's not a fully competitive market. I tried to actually, Ralph, to stay away from things like you just mentioned, drugs, because, it's so idiosyncratic in terms of the patents. But I tried to deal with more everyday items that you would think.
Yes.
One of the hardest ones I ever did was why a dozen roses on Valentine's Day, costs today, in today's dollars, it would be, $35, where, 2 weeks later, it'll cost, $15 at Giant and $12.50 at Safeway. And so looking at the extra markup on Valentine's Day.
Well, my takeaway from your articles, one of my takeaways is, because, reading economic history, the corporations always like to blame worker wages and salaries for their price of their products. And I remember in your calculations, as you took each stage markup from raw materials, so on, the labor was really quite a small chunk of that, wasn't it?
It is. There are certain kinds of service industries where you might find labor be a third to a half of the cost. Something that's a personal trainer or something like that. Obviously, if the personal trainer works for some sort of company that you get the personal trainer through, you can probably assume that the personal trainer gets half of it. But then you have to say to yourself, well, wait a minute, if he only gets or she only gets half, who gets the other half? And the answer is, the gym through which you book the personal trainer. And yes, there's equipment there that the gym has to pay for, and marketing and that sort of thing. But the markup is pretty good. But even in the most service-oriented, personal service-oriented businesses, 50% is pretty much the top of the line. So the rest of it goes to, other stuff like marketing, like, rent and equipment, but it also goes to profit.
Like marketing for cosmetics, the amount of what you pay for cosmetics, for example, for the raw materials and manufacture is trivial compared to all the advertising promotion. Some cosmetic companies spend 40% of their revenues just on advertising. The other takeaway I have is looking at your articles helps consumers bargain. So when they walk into a store, they're more aware of these huge markups, which are, of course, never on the price ticket, but they're more fortified to bargain and to demand instead of just take whatever is given. How would people get a hold of these articles? You go to the Washington Post website. Can you give them some guidelines?
You can't, because they were an infographic, and I don't think they scanned them in a digital way. You'd have to literally go to the physical papers if they were at a library, or you go down to the Washington Post office. They might have them, but honestly, you can't get them. I know, Ralph, because we talked about it at the time, you loved them. The executive editor of the paper loved them. They would literally take a week of my time.
Just to do one, like roses.
To do one.
Yeah.
And after a while, maybe I did 20 of them, and I said after a while, first of all, it gets a little boring, and secondly, it's just too much time.
Yeah.
Because this information is not, readily. Obviously, companies don't want you to know this. And
well, maybe this is a task for Consumer Reports, published by Consumers Union. Maybe they could do that. I just think it has a lot of benefit to regular consumers and workers as well.
And that's a wrap.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.